Tonight's communicator and teacher is one of my closest friends. He's family to me, legitimately. He is part of my family, or I guess I'm more of a part of his family. He's the senior pastor of our church. And when I think about the message tonight and I think about kind of what tonight is all about, there really is no one better to give the message tonight. It's someone who's seen a lot of change in their life because he's been incredibly disciplined. He's led our church movement for the past 20-something years very faithfully and very diligently. I can tell you that he genuinely loves God. He genuinely pursues God every morning and every night and every moment in between. And I'm just really, really privileged that I get to sit underneath his leadership, that I get to learn from him tonight. I hope that you have a notebook with you because I know he's going to encourage you and I think he's going to challenge you in a couple ways that we all need to be challenged in. So Overflow, can you help me welcome to the stage my friend and my pastor, Mike Ashcraft.
Hey, everybody. Thank you. Thank you, Carson, for your very kind words. I think there are probably a lot of lessons along the way to learn and to try and figure out what it is for us, to understand what God wants from us, what it looks like to bear His image, what it looks like to be a student, here in Wilmington, and trying to figure out what it is that you're supposed to be doing, and what God wants you to do. And one of the things I hope, that last song, Carson's right, that song is one of the ones that just kind of your vision just kind of gets bigger and bigger and bigger as the song builds. And I hope you almost every time I sing that song, I get teary-eyed at the part where it says, God of salvation, God of salvation, you chased down my heart through all of my failures and pride. On a hill that you created, the light of the world, abandoned to darkness, and darkness to die. But as you speak, do you hear what it says? 100 billion failures disappear. You know what that means? It means all the things that you think that you have done, all the things that you think have kept you or are keeping you from the kind of life that He has chased you down, and they begin to disappear. And this is what I really love about this series that you're in, talking about this fighting, since we have the freedom to fight for the life that God has created us for, has made available to us. And so that's what I want for us to consider now as we talk about this idea of focus. And I'm probably a really good candidate or person to talk about focus because focus has been a very hard-fought battle for me. In fact, much of my life, I just believed that I couldn't focus. I believed that I didn't have discipline, and that just went on for years and years and years and years and years. I just worked harder and harder and harder to try to learn how to focus, to try to learn how to deal with all the chaos that was in my brain and how I didn't work right and all those different things. So I'm not sure where you are, but I assume in this room, there are probably many of you who are you're super good at procrastinators. Any procrastinators in here tonight? Perfect. You wait till the last minute. Your motto is, I just work better under pressure. And so you're always under pressure. Any of you guys you think you just have attention issues. You can't pay a lick of attention to hardly anything for very long, right? You just struggle with that. You feel like your mind's all over the place. You're pulled in a million different directions. And so what I want to back up and I want us to do is I want to just sort of think about two things as I introduce this. And I've got to give you some context. If you've been listening to me for very long, you'll have to forgive me for repeating myself, except for the fact that you probably should write this down and get this committed to the way in which you see. This has sort of set the trajectory of my life for the better part of 25 years, starting in high school and college with learning how to sort of wrangle this thing between my ears, this thing that always seemed to get me in so much trouble, that always seemed to create so much doubt, that always tended to create so much shame, that always tended to undermine all the things that I really wanted, and to learn how to do that. And so you have to back up and think about how human beings work. And human beings are sort of made up of these three components. Your mind, just in case you have a bright idea. Your heart, this centerpiece of you where you feel and you want and you long and you hope. And then there's this other part of us that we spend so much time on. And I'm sorry if I made you look like this, but your body, your flesh, your physical body. And all of these are related to one another. I think you know this, right? In fact, it's interesting that when we talk about this, the great command is to love the Lord your God with all of your heart, with all of your mind, with all of your strength. These are things that they knew and Jesus would talk about very intentionally. I remember I learned this. I did yoga class for a while. I'm pretty good at yoga. Not really, but I know I can do a crow and stuff like that. So I went to my first, I don't have time to talk about this. Let's back up. I may get to that in a minute. So I want you to, this is what I want you to consider. I'm going to chase rabbits. I want to be very focused on what we're going to do tonight. The way we work and the way you work is being undermined all of the time. There's a lot of places in the scriptures that give us not just clues, but very clear ideas as to how we're to live within ourselves. I've been here before and I've said this, that the first place of dominion that you are to exercise is your own body, is your own mind, your eyes and your hands and your feet. The part of God's call on your life is to subdue the earth and to exercise dominion and to bring yourself to the world. And that first layer, that first place of dominion, of rule, of reign is over your own body, over your own mind, over your own heart. And it talks about this in Proverbs chapter 4. It says that the heart is to be guarded. Guard your heart because from it flows everything else. That's Proverbs chapter 4, verse 24 or 25. I think it's 24. To guard your heart. That doesn't mean build a wall around it and make sure that no one ever hurts you. It means to make sure that there's nothing that undermines God's work in your life, to protect it from anything that would threaten or undermine or pull you away from what God longs to do in your life. The mind. Romans chapter 12, verse 1 and 2, do not be conformed by the patterns of this world, but be transformed. Any guesses? By the renewing of your mind. The mind is to be renewed. It is to be trained daily. Then you got the body, the thing that does the downward dogs and all the other stuff. Multiple places in the scriptures, you read things like this. Paul says, I run the race as a runner who is fixed on the prize, as a boxer, not beating the air, but very focused. And he says, I buffet my body and I make it my servant. I bring my body into submission. And the way I think about this is the body sometimes has to be forced into things. The body often wants to do things that aren't good for you. When you're supposed to exercise, the body wants to lay on the couch. When you're supposed to go to class, the body wants to stay in bed, right? You know this is how we work. The body has to be brought into submission, has to operate according to something that governs it. Paul says this in 1 Thessalonians. He says, it is God's will for you that you be sanctified, that you be transformed, that you be returned to his image. That's what sanctified is, that you be returned to this image, this way of life that God, this person that God has intended you to be. And then he says this, that you abstain from sexual immorality, that each person learn how to possess their bodies with holiness and honor. One of the things that's really interesting that's happening in our culture is the body shaming and all the things that go along with that. And all of you experience this. And it's this undermining of what God has created you and how he's called you to be. This isn't about being hot or swole or whatever word we use today to describe stuff. It's about learning how to possess your body with the person that you are in holiness and in honor. It's to learn how to live within ourselves and out of ourselves to become the kind of people that we've been created to be. So how does this work? How do we do this? For a long time, I'm a simple guy. I literally draw pictures. My journal looks like this. Most of the time I have to work hard to write words. But there's a process that I've been mulling on for the better part of 20 years, and I use these 3 words. Encounter. Anybody heard this before? Formation. Expression. And this is basically what you see, this is what you do, and this is what happens in between those 2 things. Encounter is what it is that you see, what you behold, what you experience, your view of the world. The expression of your life is the way in which you live, all the things that just come out of you. If you're constantly angry, constantly fearful, constantly anxious, constantly trying to prove yourself, constantly trying to be in the end, constantly afraid of being left out, constantly trying to make sure, whatever it is, that's the expression. There's a reason. It's because of what you see. It's what you've encountered. Because everything that you see does something to your heart. The reason we are commanded to do this is because our mind, the gateway to our mind is our eyes. So it goes here, it shapes our heart, it makes its way out into the way we live our lives. This is encounter, formation, expression. So let me see if I can make this really, really clear. If you're 6 years old, and you know that like little kids, you're born with almost no natural fears. You can put a baby with a snake and they'll pet it. There's just you learn these things, which is actually interesting. You learn to be afraid of things. So what happens is when you're 6 years old and you see a dog, you go up to pet this dog and this dog bites you, right? You've encountered something. And what does it do to you inside? It makes you afraid of dogs. So the next time you see a dog, what do? You wince, you recoil, you pull back. Because what you have learned, what you have encountered has shaped something in you. It has taught you something. It has caused you to be a kind of person who is afraid of dogs. And it's valid because you got bit. So imagine if you grow up and the most stabilizing relationships that are supposed to help you kind of find your footing disappear because of your family or your parents or something happens in your home. And what you learn, what you encounter is that you can't trust people to do what they say. You can't trust people to be faithful to you. You can't trust your heart with other people. Guess what happens to you inside? Do you grow more outward and wanting for people, or do you grow more recoiled and guarded and hesitant, more independent? And then guess what happens? Guess what comes out of our lives? We learn that we can't trust people. And so this is how we live. Everything's always stiff-armed. Everything's always kept at a distance. Whatever it is that you encounter shapes and forms your heart. And he says, guard your heart, because from this place is everything that comes out of you. That makes sense, right? Are you following along? Everybody's getting this? Okay. I got some really funny stories I could tell, and it would take 3 hours to do it. So I'm going to try to be really focused. So my point is this. What you see, what you set your eyes on, will determine the kind of life that you're going to live. It'll determine the direction that you go. So what you have to do is to find a way to pay attention to what it is that you see. And if we're honest, most of our lives move too fast There's too much pressure, too many things, too much input that we can't, for the life of us, figure out what we see. And what I'll tell you is this, that whatever catches your eye will eventually capture your heart. Whatever it is that gets your attention on a regular basis is going to do something inside of you, and it is impossible for it not to get out. So that's where we're going to sort of set this up tonight. I want to outline this because we are fighting for the kind of life that God has for you, that Jesus has made available to you. And the thing that keeps you from that is more than likely some version or some idea, some concept of sin, some expression of sin that keeps undermining and eroding us. And this is where Carson started last week. We're going to pick up from here. Hebrews chapter 12, verses 1 through 3. Therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, and he's talking about, right, this, I think Carson explained this last week. He's talking about all these people that have gone before us. We always build on the lives of those who go before us. As cool as we are today, we rode on the shoulders of those who've gone before us. We are surrounded by a legacy and people who've paved the way and made a way for us to be the way that we are, right? So since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witness, this is what he says, let us throw off everything that hinders and what? The sin that so easily entangles. Don't miss this. How many of you guys know, if I said what sin or sin pattern or what thing gets you over and over and over again, how many of you would you know what that is? You could write it down on an index card. I want to see your hand. You know what it is that gets you. You know what it is that you keep promising yourself that you're not going to do anymore. And then what happens is we are so hard on ourselves because our approach to sin is one of two ways. And it says it very clearly. It says you got to get rid of everything that keeps you stuck and keeps you getting tangled up in these thought patterns and these relationships, in this way of using your mind or your heart or your body. You got to do whatever it takes. The sin that so easily entangles. The way you can always tell if something has you tangled up is two ways. Number one is you find yourself promising never to do it again. And then you are doubly mad when you do it again. If that's you, that's the pattern. Or number two, you start trying to find ways to justify it. You're looking up verses in the Bible to see why your thing isn't really a thing. And if you're trying to do one of those two things, you can bet that is the sin that so easily entangles that God is probably asking you, hey, pay really close attention to this. And so he says very clearly here that we got to do everything we can to get out of this trap of the sin that so easily entangles. And then he says this, let us run with perseverance the race that is marked out for us. Run with perseverance. Do you know what that implies? There's going to be resistance. It's going to be hard. And you're probably going to want to quit or give up or give in. That's what's implied. Then he adds this. Fixing our eyes on Jesus. The author or the perfecter, the author, I think what it says, the author, pioneer, and the perfecter of our faith. For the joy set before him, he endured the cross, scorning its shame, and he sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Then he gives us another command to consider him who has endured such opposition from sinners so that you don't give up or give in. I'll leave that verse up. There's two things we're told to do, two observations. You may take the first one. What's the first thing he tells us to do? It's the very first three words. Fix your eyes. Because whatever it is that you set your eyes on is going to be the thing that shapes your heart. To fix your eyes on Jesus. And then he just gives descriptions of him. And the second thing that he says is to consider him. To consider him. So I wrote this down, and this is where I want to start giving you some permission in your own life. These two sort of big ideas that come in here. Is that number one is that you get to choose what you will focus on. I know it doesn't feel like that all the time, but you get to choose what it is that you focus on. You get to choose. It feels impossible, doesn't it? Because we are pulled in so many different directions. The reason is because that's what we're used to. You get to choose what it is that you focus on. The second thing that we are asked to do is to consider what it is that you see when you focus. One of the things that your generation particularly faces, I think it's a unique challenge, is everything is so fast and it's so hypey and it's so quick. And it's all designed to appeal to your mind, to make you think that something has happened when nothing has actually occurred. To make you think that you believe something or think something or know something without it actually having to take any root inside of your heart or your soul. So there's a lot of hype, a lot of talk about believing, a lot of talk about these things, and all it is just these little thought bombs that have just dropped into your brain, have exploded and then disappeared. Which is why he says you've got to fix your eyes and then you've got to consider what it is that you see. What are the implications of possessing your body in holiness and honor? It's one thing to go, oh yeah, that's awesome, I agree with that. It's another thing for it to take root and to become the way in which you live your life. This only happens when we renew our mind. We renew our mind. It is the renewal of our mind that we are transformed into his image. And you begin to see this whole thing unfold. One of the things I thought it's so important because we're fighting. There's discipline. And the discipline is not to stop doing the things that you have been doing or not stop doing the things that have entangled you. That's just a part of the process to get rid of the things that keep you entangled, that keep you sort of pulled down, and to step into another place where you can see something and then determine or consider what it is that you see. And this isn't, people ask me all the time, Mike, what's the quick step? There are no quick, easy steps. The only way to learn to focus is to focus. There are no easy steps. They're simple, but they're not easy. When we talk about sin, and Carson said this last week, he said, your sin doesn't define you, but it will cost you. And all of us probably know this, but what does it cost you? What does it cost you? See, this is where we have to start. We have to start understanding. We try to figure out what is it that we are seeing. We hear things like, oh, the wages of sin is death, right? This is Romans 3:23. And if you've been around me long enough, you know that you should never quote Romans 3:23 without quoting Romans 3:24 because it's one sentence. It says the wages of sin is death, but the free gift of God is eternal life, right? It's both of those. And then it goes on. It talks about the fact that that one thing has caused us to be dead, but God has determined to redeem us and to call us back into his own. So it's this idea that the wages of sin is death. So what does this actually mean for us? If it doesn't define you, but it costs you. Sin is a broken trust long before it is a broken rule. It is a broken relationship long before it is a broken rule. And we've got to get this into the way we think about this. Sin is depending on anything or trusting in anything other than God as our source of life. And one of the most profound things that I've learned in the last 10 to 15 years is this. A lot of us have grown up, perhaps you've grown up. When you think about what sin so easily entangles, you immediately get out your list of things. When I was in like 6th or 7th grade or something, I remember trying to wage war on sin. And back then it was like, don't drink, don't smoke, don't cuss. So I said bad words, and so I worked really hard not to say bad words anymore. And we were in middle school. We used to actually have our friends punch us in the arm if we said a bad word. And it kind of worked because eventually I stopped cussing because I got tired of getting hit. You're in 6th grade, right? That's what you do. And then you begin to think like, okay, I don't drink, I don't smoke, and I don't cuss. I must be perfect. And you realize that you're not perfect and there's more to it. And you realize that somehow there's no sort of moral thing that's going to make you feel the way you think that you are. And so over the years, I just kept wrestling this. What is this war with sin? What does it look like to wage war in this area? What I realized is this, and this is where I want you to pay attention, because when it talks about guarding our hearts, when it talks about exercising dominion over our minds and our hearts and our body, what this has to do with isn't your behavior. It has to do with what governs you. It has to do with who or what has the right to tell you that something is okay or not okay, or you should not do something. That sin, before it is a moral issue, is first and foremost an authority issue. A lot of us have grown up thinking that sin is a list of moral deficiencies or things that we have done to violate God, and it is not. Sin is an authority issue. It is the rule of sin and death, the reign of this, that anything that is outside of God's life. A lot of us think that when we talk about the wages of sin is death, we think that means it's going to be like our physical death, we're going to die, and God doesn't kill us because we keep living. But if you think about it, death is not the end of a thing. Death is being separated from life. So when it says the sin that so easily entangles, what happens to us? When sin doesn't define you, but it costs you, what does it cost you? It's not the consequences that you pay for getting caught. To be entangled in sin patterns does something to your heart. Because a lot of us, if we're honest, and I've experienced, you get trapped in sin patterns, what do you start wanting? More of it. More of it. Sometimes it's to compensate, sometimes it's I've already blown it, sometimes it's whatever it might be. But this is the kind of, what it does is it separates us from the life that we have been created for. This is why this idea of fighting for this is so important. This idea of being tempted, being pulled, being led astray by what we desire is a matter of us fixing our eyes and considering what it is that we see. A lot of us have this view of God. I think Carson mentioned this last week, that he's sort of this moral, therapeutic deism that we look to sort of make us, and basically it's sent two things. It's like, well, I am good because I'm moral, I do right things, and the things that I don't do right, I just sort of justify them because this is okay anyway. Number two is that I have to feel good. And number three is that God is cool with it. And we don't have a view of God that compels us enough to be shaped or changed into his image. It's getting our eyes up to see him, to see who he really is. This is why he says to fix your eyes on Jesus, to look to him. He is the author, the perfecter, the pioneer, the finisher of what it is that we are looking for, what we are longing for. And James, you see this again, we could just kind of go, there's just so many places in the Bible where this is talked about, these tendencies and these temptations that we all face. And he talks, he says, God doesn't tempt us, but when we are tempted, here's what happens. Verse 14 of the book of James, chapter 1. But each person is tempted when he is dragged away, when they are dragged away, by their own evil desire and enticed. When we are dragged away by what we see, and it begins to toy with us in our longings. It begins to say, oh, this would be so nice to experience this here. It would be so nice to have the upper hand in this. It would be so nice if someone didn't know this about me. All these things that cause us not to trust or to remove our eyes. This is how this whole thing gets enticed. Then, after sin, after desires conceived, and we start wanting, it gives birth to these activities, to this, and it's not just the activity, it's life underneath this rule. We have now started to obey a different voice. We've started to follow a different rule. We've said that the person who gets to determine what I will do or won't do is me. Now we've been enticed and lured away, and when it is full grown, it gives birth to death. And if you think about this in terms of what I just said, it doesn't mean that you're physically going to die. What it means is you're going to be separated from the life that you want. And I think all of us can relate to that. We all have done things or pursued things or started into patterns, and we get 2 or 3 steps down the road or 10 or 20 steps down the road, and we go, what has happened to me? What has happened to you is what death looks like. It's where you are separated from the life for which you have been created. There are very few things that are going to just drift you in the way of life under the rule of God's love. There just aren't many. Most of our culture, most of our education, most of our philosophies are all designed to do what you want, to make sure that you're happy, to make sure that you're cool, and to make sure that God is cool with you. And what you've got to resolve in your own heart and say, Lord, can I see you clearly enough? Can I pursue you? Such that an encounter with you will begin to shape me and form me into the kind of person who wants you. Last verse I want to mention, I think it's interesting to pay attention to the language. The warlike language. This is all through the scriptures when it talks about this. A lot of us, we play mind games with ourselves and with each other, with other people, not realizing that it's a war. It's a war. And here's how it's written. This is in 2 Corinthians chapter 10, starting at verse 3. It says, though we live in the world, right, we're here, we do not wage war as the world does. The weapons that we fight with are not weapons of this world. On the contrary, they have divine power to demolish strongholds. Y'all sang real loud when we sang that earlier. Remember this? Strongholds bow before the Savior. Ooh. That means the things that keep grabbing you are pulled up by the roots. That takes work. It takes getting in with people that you trust. It takes community. But it says that the contrary, these weapons, there's a divine power to demolish, to uproot this rule of sin that have plagued you. And it goes on, it says this: we demolish the arguments and every pretension that sets itself up against what we know about God. And do you suppose you know everything you need to know about God? Nope. So the mind needs to be renewed over and over and over and over and over and over and over again. This idea of the arguments and pretension, this is where you talk to yourself. This is the voice, right? This says this, you justify this, you set it up against what you know about God. And some of you are better at justifying your own behavior than others. And when you know that you're prone to justify your behavior, you find someone that you trust and say, hey, am I just trying to justify my behavior here, or is this really of the Lord? And you really start to pursue these things because you're taking everything that sets itself, that tries to undermine God's work in you, and you set it up against what you know about God, what you can find out, what you can see, to fix your eyes on Him and then to consider what it is that you see. And then you do that, and then the next thing I think is so unbelievably powerful, and this is the single most life-changing principle, and I'm not even a principled guy, right? Like I don't like just give principles. This is the single most life-changing principle that I've experienced as someone who has a nutty ADD brain, was this next line. Put it back up there, verse 5. It says, and we take every thought captive. You've heard me talk about this before. This means that you can think your thoughts. You are not a victim of the things that pop into your brain. You can pull that thought up and say, does this have merit? Does this have truth? What is this? How does this stack up against what I see and know about Jesus? And then you take that thought and you make it obedient to Jesus. Anything that, because you are learning how to possess, and this requires us to run this race with perseverance, to build endurance, to possess our minds and our hearts and our bodies with holiness and with honor, to be totally available for what He has created us for. Because this is the life that you actually want. This is the life that you want. So what you have to do is you have to learn how to live in a posture of surrender. I'm not sure if I've talked about this here or not, but I'm going to again anyway. I can't remember. Something happened in my brain a few years ago. But what a lot of us do, I'm trying to figure out how I can put this out. A lot of us, we have a moment in time where we are really serious and we are convicted. Maybe it was passion or wherever it was, and you're like, man, I'm serious. And you promise God, I'm surrendering, that's it, everything. And then you get back. Things happen, school, overflow. And it's like, dadgummit, a whole year's gone by. You're like, I don't know, I'll go back to passion again next year. And so a whole year goes by, you come back to passion a year later, and you're like, dang it, I'm serious. I'm gonna surrender. So you surrender. And just for you math majors in here, the points between these things is called an interval. Remember this? So I call them surrender intervals. It's the point or the amount of time between these points of surrender. So if you surrendered at Passion 2021 or 2020, because I don't think, anyway, you get the idea. And you come back a year later and you surrender the next year, your surrender interval is how long? You can say it out loud. It's 1 year, one whole year. When I was a youth minister, this is what used to happen because we would have kids every summer at camp. They come home, come to camp, surrender, summer happens, they don't show back up. The next year they got in trouble, they come back to summer camp, they surrender again. And that's, you know what the key is? It's not giving kids a year. Let's do something every 6 months. We had like a winter camp. So at a summer camp and a winter camp, kids would go to the summer camp, they'd surrender, they'd come back, go to the winter camp, surrender. That interval was 6 months, right? It's pretty good. So I said, man, that ain't working either. Let's get a camp in the middle. Let's get something in the middle. So we had like a fall retreat and then a spring retreat and then a summer camp and a winter camp. So it's like basically kids show up end of every camp. They say, God, I'm going to surrender to you every 3 months, these surrender intervals. You get the idea? You see the picture? So a lot of you, right, you come in, you're like, oh man, I come on Tuesday, I'm in. I'm serious. Then you have the weekend. Then you got to recover from the weekend, so you come back on Sunday. And you're like, man, I shouldn't have done that, but I'm serious this time. So you got from Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. You got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right? You got 5 days surrender interval. And the great thing is, because Sunday's like such a holy day, anyway, Monday's such a dead day, it's Tuesday and you feel like a saint. You don't need to surrender again the next week because you're already good. But this is what happens. So we go these 5 days and 2 days, and some of you have gotten really good because you do your quiet time every single day. You wake up in the morning, and you do your devotion, and so every 24 hours, right, every day, you're like, God, I'm serious, I'm in. That was kind of my life. I finally got to a point where like, man, every day I wake up in the morning, God, I surrender my life to you. You know what I realized? 24 hours is way too long. I get up in the morning, it's like, God, I'm like in. This day is gonna be yours. Then my kids get up and you're ready to kill somebody. Just like that. And you know what most of us do when we get up and we blow something? We go, I'll just wait till tomorrow. I'll just wait till the next service. I'll just wait till the next time. When I realized, man, as soon as something happens, I just need to resurrender again and again. What I learned is that the way I need to learn how to walk with the Lord is to just basically surrender to Him in the same way that I breathe. I just need with every breath to say, Lord, I'm in and I'm yours. Lord, I'm in and I'm yours. Lord, I'm in and I'm yours. And the reason I say this is because surrendering isn't about you promising not to do things anymore. Surrendering isn't this idea of I'm going to promise God I'm serious and trying to convince Him by your remorse or your shame or whatever it is. Surrendering is to embrace the reality of God's presence and His promise to do that which He has promised to do in your life as you learn to walk with Him by faith. Lord, help us to take every thought captive and to make it obedient to Jesus Christ. I do that with a pen and a piece of paper. And Nick's met with me for coffee, and a lot of you met with me for coffee. I'm going to tell you 100% of the time what I tell you. Get a piece of paper out, write down what you're thinking, write down what is going on, to look at Jesus, look at what's happening, and to consider it And I'll tell you, for a lot of us, the reason our brains are so overrun, and I'm a fan of phones and social media. I like it a lot. But it is killing some of you. And you need to put your phone down, and you need to pick up a pen and start to fix your eyes on Jesus. And you need to consider what it is that you see longer than 15 seconds. It's not easy, but it is simple. Because we don't wage war the way the world does. We're not trying to entertain ourselves into feeling better about ourselves. We believe that God has made us with purpose and intention and call and gifts, and that He's serious about us exercising dominion over our minds and our hearts to possess our bodies with holiness and honor so we can be available to live in the reality of His presence and the reality of His promise to form you into the image in which He intends for you to be. It's a promise. And you don't want to miss it because you weren't paying attention. I know you don't. So, as we close, we're going to surrender. We're going to talk about that tonight. Sing about that. But you're big boys and girls, right? You're all college students. You're smart. You know what is happening in your minds when you do this and this and this. You know what is happening in your hearts when you do this and this and this. You know the patterns. You know the habits. What I would encourage you to do is to get with some people that you trust, maybe some of our staff and pastoral team here, but to get with some people that you trust and start to wrestle those things out so you can learn to work together to fix your eyes on Jesus and to consider Him as you run with perseverance and live with perseverance the kind of life that God has made available for you. And you fight by fixing your eyes, by focusing, all right? Father, would you make yourself seeable? God, there are lots in this room who I know are so racked with guilt and their minds are overrun with what they've done, what's expected of them, what's demanded of them, the pressures they've placed on themselves. For some of them, it's headspace issues. For some of them, it's body issues. For some of them, it's something that has happened to them that is so devastating. And our lives have just been responding to this for so long. God, would you help us to see you? God of salvation, you chase down our hearts through all of our stubbornness and pride. And on a hill that you created, the light of the world, abandoned in darkness to die. But as you speak, as you enter in, 100 billion failures just disappear. You lost your life so we could find you here. If you left the grave behind, God, then so should we.